The almanac on the shelf of the Helena General Store predicted the coldest winter in a decade, and the man who'd printed it had been right about weather 3 years running. Astrid Voss read that single line twice on the morning of September 17, 1876, while Gunnar Voss stood in the doorway of the cabin that had belonged to his brother and now belonged to him, watching her with the particular patience of a man who has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for the physical world to catch up to his decision. She set the almanac back on the shelf without buying it. She already knew what it said. She'd felt the change in the air 2 weeks prior, the way the cold came earlier in the evening and stayed longer into the morning, the way the elk had moved down from the high country a full month ahead of schedule. Her father had taught her to read those signs in the Black Forest of Baden before she was 10 years old, and 23 years in Montana had only sharpened what he'd started. She had 2 flour sacks, a splitting maul, and $7 in coins. The flour sacks held everything she'd been permitted to take from the cabin: a wool dress, a second pair of boots with the left sole separating at the toe, a tin cup, a folding knife with a cracked handle that had belonged to her father, a small jar of rendered fat she'd put up herself, in the pocket watch that had been Heinrich's, which kept time poorly, but was the only object in the world that still smelled faintly like him when she held it close. The splitting maul she'd owned since 1866. The $7 represented the sum total of what Gunnar had deemed hers from 3 years of shared household accounts, calculated by him alone, announced to her 3 days after they'd put Heinrich in the ground. She did not argue with Gunnar's math. She'd already understood, in the first hours after Heinrich's death, that the cabin and everything in it would revert to his brother by the logic of frontier property, which was not always the logic of courts, but was always the logic of men with deeds and neighbors willing to back them up. Gunnar was not a cruel man. He'd given her a week longer than she'd expected and offered to write a letter of reference to the boarding house on Bridge Street, which was a gesture that cost him nothing and would have cost her everything, because the Bridge Street boarding house required references and 2 months' payment in advance and did not extend credit to widows regardless of their references. She declined the letter. He nodded as though he had anticipated exactly that. She walked out the door at 2 in the afternoon with 6 hours of daylight remaining. The first thing she did before she walked half a block was stop and count. Not the money, she knew the money. She counted time. 6 hours of light. 47 days if the weather held at its current pattern before the first killing freeze. 1 month after that, before the deep cold arrived and stayed. The almanac's prediction of the coldest winter in a decade sat in her mind like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading outward into calculations that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with physics. A Montana winter in a 12 by 12 space required 4 cords of split wood at minimum. 4 cords needed to stay dry, or they would produce smoke instead of heat. And smoke in a sealed sleeping space killed people as reliably as cold more quietly, without the warning of pain. She had watched it happen to a Norwegian family 3 miles east of Helena in the winter of 1874. They'd found all 4 of them in the morning arranged as though sleeping, the fire long gone out, the wood stack outside damp all the way through from a November rain that had frozen into ice before it could drain. The father had been 43, the children were 9 and 11, Astrid was 41. She had no intention of being found arranged as though sleeping. The conventional solution, a separate woodshed 8 by 12 milled lumber tin roof, raised floor, ran between $30 and $40 in materials alone, not counting the labor of raising it, not counting the hardware, not counting the time. She had $7.47 days and 2 hands that were capable of work that would have broken men half her age, and she knew this about herself without pride or sentiment, simply as a fact she'd verified repeatedly over decades. The problem was not capacity. The problem was capital, and capital was not something that could be manufactured from determination alone, unless you change the problem. She walked south along Prickly Pear Creek rather than toward town, which caused the 3 men on the boardwalk outside Kelleher's Hardware to watch her with the particular attention of people observing someone doing something unexpected. She paid them no notice. The creek ran clear and cold this time of year, the cottonwood along its banks going yellow at the edges, the willow still holding green. She'd walked this stretch enough times to know it as well as she knew her own hands, and what she was looking for was something she'd mentally cataloged 2 years prior without yet having a use for it. The canyon narrowed about a quarter-mile south of the lumber company's staging area. The north-facing slope on the east side turned steep enough that she could calculate from the angle alone how snow would accumulate there in January. Deep. Piled against the rock face and packed hard by the prevailing northwest wind, which meant the rock face itself would be largely protected from direct loading, which meant any structure built against it low enough to stay below the primary wind channel would shed snow by diversion rather than by resistance. She found the alcove where she'd expected it, a rock slide old enough that lichen had colonized most of the exposed surfaces, had left a natural hollow in the hillside semicircular roughly 11 feet across at the opening, cutting back into the slope, perhaps 6 feet at its deepest point. The exposed rock face curved inward with a geometry that was, if not quite deliberate, at least cooperating, like the inside of a barrel that had been cut in half lengthwise and pressed against the earth. The floor was relatively flat, covered in a decade's worth of accumulated debris, dead leaves, pine needles, small rocks that had worked their way loose from the ceiling, but the ceiling itself was solid, the kind of geological solidity that didn't announce itself and didn't need to. She put her palm flat against the back wall and felt nothing move. 4 men from the Helena Lumber Company staging area were watching her from downstream. She could feel their attention without turning to look. She knew what they were seeing, a middle-aged German widow crouching in a rockslide cavity, touching the walls, doing the arithmetic of some project they couldn't yet identify. She did not perform for them or against them. She walked the perimeter of the alcove, opening twice, measuring with her feet, then stood at the exact center of the mouth and looked out at the angle of the hillside above the trajectory of the snowpath. She'd calculated the arc of the creek, the direction of the prevailing wind. If she could close the front of this alcove, close it with something curved low enough to fall below the wind channel, integrated enough with the hillside that snow would simply redirect around it, then the hillside itself became the back wall, the floor, the insulation. The rock would absorb and hold heat from any fire she built inside. The elevation kept her above the floodline. The orientation meant afternoon sun would warm the south face during the months it mattered. The alcove's natural depth gave her 6 feet of storage before she even added a single stick of structure. She was not building with the land, she was building from it. The cottonwood and willow growing thick along the creek bottom were most of them under 4 inches in diameter, too green to split for firewood, too flexible to use as structural lumber in any conventional sense. Her father had spent her childhood explaining to anyone who would listen that the limitations of a material were only limitations if you insisted on using it wrong. Green wood bent without breaking. Seasoned wood held its shape. If you bent green wood into the shape you wanted and held it until it seasoned, it became that shape permanently, as though it had always intended to grow that way. The Black Forest charcoal burners had built temporary shelters with this technique for generations before she was born. She had helped her father construct 3 of them before her 12th birthday. She borrowed a bucksaw from a man named Porter, who ran a small freight operation near the creek and had known Heinrich slightly. She returned it before sunset as promised. In the hours between, she cut 12 saplings, cottonwood and willow, in roughly equal proportion, each approximately 14 feet long and as thick as her own wrist. She dragged them to the alcove in 2 trips, arranged them in order of flexibility, and stood for a moment looking at them laid out on the ground like the ribs of something enormous and not yet assembled. Then she drove 2 stakes into the creek soil at the exact lip of the alcove opening, 11 feet apart, using the back of the splitting maul. The first sapling she buried 18 inches deep on the left side, tamping the earth around it until it held without wobbling. Then she bent it slowly with the weight of her body rather than the strength of her arms, letting gravity and time do the work. That force would damage into a smooth arc overhead and anchored the other end in a corresponding hole on the right side. The result was a semicircle of living wood spanning the full width of the alcove mouth, its apex at roughly 7 feet, curving with a clean geometry that owed nothing to milled lumber and everything to the fact that a living tree bent slowly and held long enough remembered the shape it was given. She did this 11 more times. Each arch spaced 16 inches from the last, each one seated a little deeper into the ground as she moved back toward the rock face until the outermost arch stood free and the innermost was nearly touching the stone. The framework by late afternoon looked like the entrance to a tunnel or the skeleton of some creature from a different age, curved bones arranged with more intention than accident, catching the late light in angles that made the men downstream stop what they were doing and look. Cal Rourke came up around 2 o'clock. He'd been the engineering lead on the Northern Pacific survey crew before a mining claim near Marysville pulled him sideways from his career, and he wore his skepticism with the particular confidence of a man who'd built enough things to know when something was being built wrong. He stopped at a respectful distance and studied the framework without speaking for nearly a full minute, his hat in his hands and his head tilted at the angle of someone working through a problem they weren't sure yet was interesting or merely unfortunate. His voice came out measured, genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "That's an interesting notion you're building, Mrs. Voss." "It's a woodshed, Mr. Rourke." She didn't stop adjusting the angle of the ninth arch. He looked at the creek bottom growth, at the arches already beginning to set in their curved positions, at the complete absence of anything resembling conventional walls or a roof or a raised floor. "Cottonwood and willow won't hold snow load. First real storm will flatten this." She straightened and looked directly at him for the first time. "Snow is going to hit the hillside 20 feet above this spot and redirect. I'm not building tall enough to catch it." He opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at the angle of the slopework behind the alcove, traced the path she'd described with his eyes, and she watched him run the geometry in his head, the way engineers run geometry following the load path, checking for the failure point, finding where the calculation either held or didn't. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not agreement, not yet, but the particular recalibration of a man who's realized the question is more complicated than he initially assessed. He put his hat back on and walked away. Before he rounded the stand of cottonwood that would take him out of her sight line, he stopped and looked back at the framework once more. She noted it. She noted everything. She worked until the light was entirely gone, weaving the first willow shoots through the vertical arches in long horizontal passes over, under, over, under, each one pulled tight before the next was started. Basket weaving at architectural scale. Her fingers found the rhythm that her hands had learned as a child and never fully forgotten, the same rhythm her grandmother had used making storage containers that were still in use when Astrid left Germany at 23. By dusk, she had 3 feet of woven lattice wall curving smoothly from the rock face on the left side, closing the alcove's opening with something that already had structural integrity, not the rigidity of a board wall, but the tensile strength of interlocked living material, the kind of strength that gives rather than breaks and recovers rather than fails. She returned Porter's bucksaw. She spent the night under a tarp strung between 2 cottonwoods, listening to the creek and the coyotes in the hills, in the distant sound of Helena settling into itself for the evening piano from the saloon on Main Street, a dog objecting to something, the last freight wagon of the day making its way out toward the northern camps. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees. She slept in her coat and both pairs of stockings and was up before the light came back. September 18th brought frost that killed the last of the wild asters along the creek bank. The purple flowers went black overnight and hung from their stems like small flags of surrender. Astrid noticed them without sentiment and went back to weaving. Her fingers, stiff from the cold in the first hour, loosened as she worked. By mid-morning, she had the left side completed to 5 feet and had begun the right side's corresponding run, the 2 halves curving toward each other like arms that had not yet reached the point of joining. A handful of miners from the operations above the canyon came and went during the day. Most stayed long enough to confirm their initial impression, some variant of confusion or mild amusement, and then moved on. One of them asked if she was building a fish trap. She explained briefly and without elaboration that she was building a woodshed. He looked at the structure from multiple angles and left without arriving at a visible conclusion. William Hart arrived in the early afternoon. He was a mason and general builder out of Pennsylvania who'd come west following the mining expansion and found steady enough work repairing the structural failures that came from people building quickly in difficult climates without adequate knowledge of either the materials or the conditions. He was 51 years old, heavily built, with the hands of a man who'd been in physical conversation with stone and wood for 30 years. He stood at the edge of the work area and watched Astrid weave for nearly 5 minutes without speaking, his arms crossed and his expression focused in the way of someone cataloging details rather than forming an opinion. His voice, when it came, carried the particular flatness of professional observation, wattle and daub. Not a question. Something like it. She didn't stop working. What are you mixing into the clay? Dried grass and horse manure from the stable on the East Road. He nodded once slowly. That's why it won't crack when it freezes. The fiber keeps the matrix together when the moisture expands. He walked the perimeter of the structure, pausing at the back, where the arches met the rock face, touching the stone with his fingertips, the way she had done the day before. You've got good thermal mass at the back. Rock will hold heat for 8 to 10 hours after a fire goes out in the front area. He looked at the overlapping bark pieces she'd stacked nearby, which she'd begun cutting from the Ponderosa Ridge above. Those bark shingles you're overlapping downslope? Yes. Good. Shingled wrong, that's where the water comes in. He looked at her directly for the first time. This is going to work. She pulled the next willow shoot through its sequence. I know. He left without ceremony. She heard him a day later telling someone in the lumberyard that the German widow on the creek was doing something worth watching. The word moved through the small professional community of men who built things for a living the way such words moved in those communities, not quickly, but with a specificity that made it land differently than gossip. The clay work began on the 22nd. She found the deposit upstream that she'd identified months earlier, heavy red-brown with enough structure to hold its shape when worked. She hauled it in the 2 flour sacks repurposed as carrying vessels, mixed it with dried creek grass, and the horse manure she'd asked permission to collect from the stable on the East Road, combined them with creek water in a proportion she adjusted by feel until the mixture had the consistency and behavior she was looking for. Then she packed it into the willow lattice inside and out, building up layers until the wall was 3 inches thick at every point. The work was slow and cold and covered her forearms in reddish clay that dried and cracked and had to be rinsed at the creek before it could be worked again. By the 24th, she had the roof to address. She couldn't afford milled lumber. She couldn't afford tin roofing. She couldn't afford cedar shakes or anything else that required purchasing. And she'd already spent $4.20 of her $7.30 on the burlap she'd shaped into a door covering 40 cents, on a pound of rendered tallow for waterproofing, 60 cents on a box of 90-penny nails she'd used sparingly and precisely, and $2.90 on the small sheet metal stove she'd acquired in trade for Heinrich's pocket watch from a man named Eccles, who repaired tools and sold secondhand equipment from a shed behind the blacksmith shop. The stove was missing one leg. She'd addressed this by seating it on 3 flat stones of matched height. The ponderosa pines on the ridge above her site had thick plate-like bark that came away from the trunk in sections as much as 2 feet long and 14 inches wide, especially on the older trees where the bark had been building up for decades. She spent 2 days collecting it, climbing the lower sections of the ridge, until her hands were tacky with dried pitch and her boots had worn through the dew on the grass so thoroughly that her socks were permanently damp. She came back with 73 pieces of varying size and began laying them in overlapping courses over the arched sapling framework, starting at the base and working upward in the way that shingles work, each layer lapping the one below, each piece pinned in place with bent willow shoots passed through small holes she made with her folding knife. The bark followed the curve of the dome perfectly. It had no inclination to lie flat. It wanted to curve, and the curve it wanted was almost exactly the curve she needed. On the 27th of September, Reverend Aldous Marsh walked up from the direction of the church. He was a lean man of 46 with the kind of face that had been shaped more by conviction than by weather, precise in his movements, in the way of someone who viewed sloppiness as a moral condition. He'd been in Helena since 1870, arriving from a congregation in Ohio that had sent him west with a letter of recommendation in a clear sense that whatever problem they were solving by doing so was their own business. He ran a small but cohesive congregation and was generally regarded as a man of principle, which was true, and a man of flexibility, which was less so. He stopped at a distance that was still within conversation range, but slightly farther than friendliness required, and looked at the structure. By this point, it was nearly complete, the woven walls fully clayed, and beginning to cure in the autumn air, the bark roof shingled in smooth overlapping rows that followed the vaulted shape of the frame, the burlap door hanging from a willow pin hinge at the left side of the opening. It looked from a certain angle as though it had grown from the hillside rather than been constructed against it. He'd clearly prepared what he wanted to say. His voice, when he began, had the measured quality of someone delivering a considered position rather than an impulse. Mrs. Voss, the congregation has discussed your situation. We would like to offer you domestic employment, cleaning, laundering, meal preparation for church functions in exchange for accommodation in the church basement through the winter. The room is 8 by 10 feet, shared facilities, adequate heat. She was on the ladder she'd made from pine branches, working pitch and tallow into the upper bark courses. She didn't come down. How many hours per week, Reverend? Perhaps 30, possibly 35, depending on the demands of the season. She descended the ladder not in response to him, but because she'd finished that section. She wiped her hands on the rag she kept tucked at her waist. When she turned to face him, her expression was direct rather than combative, the look of someone engaging an argument they've already mapped. I appreciate the congregation's concern. Her voice carried a German inflection that 23 years in Montana had softened but not erased. But I'm 41 years old. I buried a husband 3 weeks ago and 2 children before that, and I've worked every day since I was 7. I have no interest in becoming a servant in a church basement. Marsh's expression tightened slightly. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Voss. So is wasting what you've been given. The words came out even and without heat, which gave them more weight than anger would have. I was given 2 hands and a mind that works. I'm using both. He looked at the structure behind her. His next words carried something underneath the theology, something that was less about her soul and more about the particular discomfort of someone whose framework for how the world should be organized was being quietly violated. This structure is not appropriate for a Christian woman. Living in a hole in the ground, working in public like a, I'm not living in it. She said it calmly before he could finish the sentence. This is a woodshed. My dwelling is 20 feet east. She gestured vaguely in that direction. She had not yet begun to dig the dugout. The ground 20 feet to the east was undisturbed, but she had located the spot, assessed the soil, determined the approach. In every meaningful sense, she had already decided where she would sleep, which meant in every meaningful sense she had not lied. Marsh looked in the direction she'd indicated. He could not see anything that resembled a dwelling because there was nothing to see, but the landscape was uneven enough that something might be screened from his angle. He chose not to press the point directly. When this fails, and the phrase landed with the specificity of a prediction rather than a worry, the congregation's offer may not remain available. She picked up the rag again and wiped pine pitch from between her fingers. Then I suppose I'd better not fail. He left. She watched him walk back toward the church, his posture carrying the particular stiffness of a man who has not been as authoritative as he'd intended to be. She understood clearly what had just happened, and it had very little to do with theology. A woman in her position in this community in this year operated within a set of social permissions that were extended and withdrawn by the men and institutions that held local authority. Marsh had come to offer his version of those permissions contained conditional administered. She had declined them. That was not in his framework, simply a practical disagreement. It was a statement about who held what kind of power, and statements of that kind had consequences in communities small enough that everyone's business was eventually everyone else's concern. She climbed back up the pine branch ladder and resumed working. The 28th of September, she counted what remained of her $7, $1.80. She had nails, tallow burlap, and a stove. She had a woodshed that was structurally complete and functionally ready. She had borrowed tools returned and obligations met. She had in the material ledger almost exactly nothing. What she had that didn't appear in ledgers, a rock-slide alcove sealed with curved wood and clay and bark built to work with the particular geometry of this hillside in this canyon in this specific climate. A design that cost $6.20 in purchased materials. A design that a trained builder had told her was going to work not from kindness, but from professional assessment. A design that if it performed the way she calculated, it would represent the difference between keeping her firewood dry and freezing to death in a Montana winter that the almanac had already told her was going to be the worst in a decade. She spent the last days of September cutting lodgepole pine from the draws above the creek. The pine grew thick there, straight, grained, and clean, the kind of wood that burned hot with minimal smoke when it was properly seasoned. She worked with the splitting maul from first light to last setting rounds on the flat boulder she'd identified as a splitting block, reading the grain before she swung, feeling the wood tell her where it wanted to separate. Her palms blistered. The blisters opened. New skin grew under them, harder and less sensitive, the body doing what it did when work was sustained and unavoidable. By the 1st of October, she had 3.5 cords stacked inside the alcove. Larger pieces on the bottom for stability, smaller splits above for airflow. Everything tilted slightly outward, so any residual moisture would drain toward the door rather than pulling in the stack. The interior of the woodshed was folded within 2 feet of the door's clearance. She could press between the stacked wood and the right-hand wall to reach pieces from depth. The structure held the wood the way a cupped hand holds water shaped around it, not imposing on it. On the evening of the 2nd of October, she stood outside the woodshed and looked at what she'd built. The structure was barely visible as something constructed. The bark roof followed the hillside's own line. The clay walls had the color and texture of the surrounding earth. The burlap door hung on its willow pin was the only element that announced human presence, and even that was subtle enough to be missed at a casual glance. Frank Dillard came past with his empty freight wagon, heading back from a supply run to the mining camps east of town. He was a quiet man who operated on an observation more than conversation, running supplies between Helena and the smaller operations that couldn't afford to send their own men in. He'd passed this stretch of creek a dozen times in the past 2 weeks and watched the woodshed take shape without comment. Now he stopped the wagon and looked at the finished structure for a long moment. His assessment when it came was brief and entirely practical. Weather's changing tonight. She looked west. The clouds had the particular yellow-gray color that preceded sustained cold rain rather than the clean blue-white that preceded snow. How long? Day and a half, maybe 2. He gathered the reins back in his hands. Wind's coming with it. The wagon moved on. She checked the burlap door's fit one more time, adjusting the pin to hang tighter. She checked the placement of the uppermost bark courses on the windward side. She walked the perimeter of the structure, looking at the transitions between wall and hillside, between roof and wall, between the ground and the bottom course of clay. Every junction was either sealed or designed to drain. Then she went to her tarp shelter, the one she was still sleeping under 20 feet east of the woodshed, and crawled in. She lay on her back with her coat pulled over her and listened to the creek. In the darkness, the cold pressed against the tarp with the patient insistence of something that does not have to hurry. She could feel the temperature dropping steadily, not the sharp drop of a clear night losing its heat to the sky, but the wet heaviness of a system moving in from the mountains with moisture to release and wind behind it. The woodshed had not been tested. It had been calculated. It had been built with technique she knew, using materials she understood, on a site she'd assessed with everything her father had taught her about reading land. But calculations and technique were not yet evidence. Evidence required the thing that was coming from the west, the thing that would arrive before morning and wouldn't stop for a day and a half. She thought about the Norwegian family in 1874. The way the water had gotten into their woodshed slowly, imperceptibly, through one inadequate seam in a roof that had looked sound, but wasn't, over the course of 3 rainstorms before the one that finally soaked through the entire stack. The way they'd had no way of knowing their wood was gradually losing its moisture content advantage until the night it failed completely, and the fire filled the space with carbon rather than heat. She thought about Heinrich's watch and Eccles's second-hand bin, keeping time poorly in a shed behind a blacksmith's shop. She thought about the 47 days that had, in 9 days of work, become 38. She closed her eyes. The first drops of rain hit the tarp, tentative, spacing themselves out the way the first drops always did, as though testing the surface before committing to the full weight of what was behind them. By morning, the full weight had arrived. The rain came in waves rather than sheets, each wave slightly colder than the last, driven by a northwest wind that had picked up steadily through the night, and by first light was sustaining at 30 miles per hour, with gusts that shook the cottonwoods along the creek and sent their remaining yellow leaves spiraling in loose arcs before plastering them against anything solid. Astrid had moved her tarp to a more protected configuration sometime before midnight, when the first serious gust threatened to peel it free, repositioning 2 of the anchor cords around heavier trees and adding a third at the windward corner. She'd slept in 2-hour intervals between the adjustments, waking with the precise alertness of someone whose nervous system had been trained over decades to treat environmental change as information requiring assessment. The temperature at dawn was 34 degrees. The creek had risen 18 inches overnight and was carrying debris, branches, a section of fence post from somewhere upstream, the kind of load that said the water table upslope was at capacity and everything additional was running straight off the surface. She stood at the creek bank for a moment and watched the brown water move, then turned and looked at the woodshed. Water was running down the hillside above the alcove in a continuous sheet, finding every natural channel and creating temporary ones where the grass had died back enough to expose bare soil. She watched where the sheet water went when it reached the level of the woodshed's roof. It hit the curve of the bark shingles on the upper windward edge and redirected. The geometry of the dome had no flat sections to accumulate, no horizontal ridgelines to pull along. The water broke into smaller flows at the point of contact and followed the curve to the sides, channeling away from the structure in 2 clean streams that ran alongside the alcove walls and disappeared into the gravel at the base of the slope. Not a seam, not a junction, not a single transition in the roofline caught or held water. It all moved. She walked around to the leeward side and checked the wall there. Dry. The clay had darkened on the windward face where water had run across it, but the surface was sealed, no cracking visible, no soft spots where the matrix had failed. The fiber reinforcement in the clay was doing exactly what William Hart had confirmed it would do, holding the material together at the cellular level, preventing the kind of freeze-thaw fracturing that turned unmodified clay into rubble over a single winter. She did not open the burlap door yet. She let the rain continue for another 6 hours. By midday, the wind had increased to 40 miles per hour. The creek was running bank full, a color between brown and orange, from the topsoil it was carrying, and the sound of it had risen from a familiar murmur to something that required slightly raised voices to speak over. The rain came in at a horizontal angle on the gusts, which tested the windward wall of the woodshed in a way that vertical rain could not, pressing at the wall rather than sliding down it, looking for any gap the clay had not fully sealed. Astrid spent the afternoon in the woodshed doorway, not inside but at the threshold, watching the weather work on the structure from a position that let her see both the external performance and the interior conditions simultaneously. The burlap door was pinned back. The interior was dim lit by the gray light coming through the vent gaps near the top of the walls, and the air inside it had the dry, slightly resinous smell of pine that has been kept properly. No dampness, no condensation on the rock face at the back. The firewood stack, visible in the low light, looked exactly as she'd left it 3 days prior. Dry surfaces, appropriate color, no mold development on the end grain. When the rain finally stopped at roughly 3 in the afternoon of October 4th, she stepped fully inside and pulled a piece from the middle of the stack. Not the outer layer, which would have been drier, regardless the middle where any moisture penetration from inadequate waterproofing would show up first. She held it close and examined the surface in the dim light, then pressed her thumbnail into the end grain at a depth sufficient to test below the surface layer. 14% moisture content. She knew that number from the feeling because she'd been testing wood long enough to calibrate it in her hands. 14% was the target. 14% was the difference between clean combustion and smoking combustion, between a fire that heated a space and a fire that filled a space with the kind of slow chemical damage that presented first as headaches and then as something worse. She set the piece back and stood inside the woodshed for a moment in the quiet that followed the storm. The creek was still running loud. The wind had dropped to a background presence. Outside, she could hear the dripping of water from the cottonwood branches, each drop hitting the saturated ground with a sound like a small definitive statement. It had worked, not as a hope or a calculation, as a demonstrated fact. The structure had been subjected to 36 hours of sustained cold rain with sustained wind and had performed according to the design. The water went around the thermal mass held. The clay sealed the bark shingles, redirected everything above. The firewood inside was identical in moisture content to firewood that had never been near a storm. She walked out and stood in the thin afternoon light, looking at the structure from the distance that let her see its whole form. It sat against the hillside as though it had been there for years. The bark roof, dark with moisture on the surface, but not penetrated the clay walls, showing the expected darkening along the wind-facing courses, the overall form so integrated with the slope geometry that it read less as construction than as landform. Cal Rourke came along the creek path an hour later. She heard him before she saw him. His particular gait had a slight unevenness from an old surveying injury to his right knee that she'd noticed on his first visit. He stopped at the standard observation distance and looked at the woodshed for a long moment without speaking. Then he walked around it, all the way around, taking his time, stopping at the leeward wall to press against the clay, with his palm crouching to look at the base where the structure met the ground, tilting his head back to follow the line of the bark roof all the way up to the ridge. When he came back around to where she was standing, his expression had the quality she'd identified on his first visit recalibration, but further along the scale past the point of reconsidering the question and into the territory of arriving at a different answer. His voice had lost the professional distance it carried in their first exchange. "Mrs. Voss, I owe you an apology." "For what, Mr. Rourke?" "For assuming you didn't know what you were doing." He looked at the woodshed again, then back at her. "I inspected this yesterday afternoon while the storm was still running. Wind was 40 miles an hour off the northwest, driving rain horizontal. I put my hand on the leeward wall and it was dry. I checked the roof junction at the windward base where water pressure is highest dry. I opened the door and stood inside for 10 minutes. No drafts, no condensation. Air inside smelled like dry wood." He paused. "I've built 3 woodsheds. Cost me between $22 and $38 each. 2 of them have had water issues. The third is solid, but it's also the one where I spent the most money on materials and still put in 2 weeks of work with a hired hand." His voice had the flat precision of professional self-assessment. Yours is better. Yours is probably neater. Neat doesn't keep you from freezing. He let that sit for a moment. Would you have any objection to me bringing some people by? I know 3 men who need covered wood storage before snow, and they're all short on capital this season. Bring them, she said. Anyone who needs to know how it was done. The men Cal brought over the following days came with varying degrees of skepticism and left with varying degrees of conviction, but they all left having asked specific questions and received specific answers. Astrid explained the sapling selection, the diameter, the length, the ratio of cottonwood to willow, why greenwood was essential rather than merely convenient. She explained the arch spacing and why 16 inches produced a structure that could bear the load she'd calculated without requiring internal support. She explained the clay mixture and the fiber ratios she'd arrived at through her own history with similar materials in different climates, and why the manure contributed more than the grass to the material's freeze resilience. She explained the bark shingle orientation and the way the overlapping courses needed to follow the curve of the dome rather than running in horizontal lines, which was counterintuitive for anyone whose experience with shingles had all been on flat pitch roofs. She did not charge for the information. She asked only that those who had extra food or materials leave something if they were able, and this was not enforced or tracked. What came back in the 2 weeks following Cal's first visit, a 20-pound sack of dried beans from a miner who'd brought more than he needed for the season, a side of smoked venison from a hunting party that had taken more game than they could use before it turned a wool blanket from a man named Caldwell, who said it had belonged to his mother and she'd want it used rather than stored 12 pounds of dried cornmeal, a small crock of lard sealed under cloth, and a bundle of kindling that someone had left without identifying themselves. Frank Dillard reappeared twice during this period, once to watch a group learning the clay technique, and once simply to observe from a slight distance the pattern of what was happening. He said very little on either visit. She understood that he was cataloging that the information would move outward with him on his supply runs, that the story would travel the way practical information traveled in communities, where practical information was the difference between surviving and not. She had no desire to manage or shape that process. The work was already visible. William Hart came back on the 10th of October with a 23-year-old apprentice named Davis who'd come west from Kentucky with ideas about mining and was discovering that his actual aptitude ran toward construction. Hart walked Davis through the completed structure the way a teacher walks a student through a finished problem. Here's what was chosen, here's why. Here's what the alternative would have looked like and why it would have performed worse in this specific context. Davis listened with the particular intensity of someone encountering a principle they'd been taught in one form and were now seeing in a completely different form that somehow explained the original principle more clearly than the original had. The curve is doing all the work the framing would have done, Davis said, crouching to look at the base of an arch where it met the ground. It's not holding the load, it's redirecting it. Correct, Hart said. He looked at Astrid with the expression of a man crediting competence without making it sentimental. Load management is always cheaper than load bearing. Most people build to resist. She built to redirect. She was refilling the kindling crib near the door and didn't comment. But she registered the formulation and later lying under her tarp on a clear night with the temperature at 22 degrees and the stars in that particular Montana configuration that made the sky look deliberately designed, she turned it over in her mind. Load management versus load bearing. She had never put it in those words, but the words described exactly what she'd been doing. Not just in the woodshed, but in the 3 weeks since Gunnar had handed her $7 and told her to be gone by sundown. The community had a weight to it. The way Marsh had framed her choice, the way the men from the lumber company had watched with skepticism, the way the Bridge Street boarding house represented a door that closed rather than opened, these were all forms of load. The conventional response was to bear them, to push against them with sustained effort until either she gave way or they did. What she'd done instead was redirect. not ignore. Redirect. Work with the pressure where the geometry permitted and reinforce at the points where it didn't. The night was cold enough to put ice on the creek edges. She listened to it tick and expand in the silence. On the 14th of October, she began digging the dugout. The soil 20 feet east of the woodshed was what she'd assessed it to be a sandy loam over a clay subsoil cooperative for the first 18 inches before it became work that required the full weight of her body on the shovel handle. She cut the outline first 4 feet by 8 feet, then began removing material in layers, each layer revealing the next. The displaced earth she mounted on 3 sides, which would eventually become the earthen roof. On the 4th side, she left the opening that would become the entry, framed with pine poles she'd cut and peeled and set in pairs on each side to hold the lintel. She worked at the dugout in the mornings and returned to the woodshed, work cutting additional firewood from the draws above, adding to her 3.5 cord supply, checking and rechecking the stack for any developing moisture in the afternoons. The cold was intensifying with the quiet regularity of a system that had already decided what it intended to do and was simply following through. The creek ice thickened from the edges inward each night. The mornings arrived darker. On the 21st of October, a woman named Ruth Garfield stopped on her way to the creek with a water bucket and watched Astrid split pine for 20 minutes without speaking. Ruth was 37, married to a carpenter who'd broken his hand in September and was still 3 weeks from being able to work with 4 children and a household that was managing, but not easily. She was not one of Marcia's congregation, but she attended occasionally when her husband was well enough to go with her. Her question, when she asked it, was practical, and without preamble, how much did the woodshed actually cost? $6.20 in purchased materials. Rest was collected. Ruth looked at the woodshed. Miles said we need 2 more cords before the end of the month. The yard on 3rd Street wants $4 a cord for anything decent. If you have time in the next 3 days, I can show you the arch technique. The building site matters most. You need a north-facing slope with natural shelter, even a small one. Does Miles have a property line near the creek? East side, yes. I'll come look at it tomorrow. Ruth left and came back an hour later with a plate of cold cornbread that she set on the flat, splitting rock without comment and walked away. Astrid ate it standing up between splitting sessions. By the end of October, she had helped 7 families begin or complete bent sapling storage structures. The designs varied by site and available materials, but held to the same core principles: curved frame clay fiber walls, bark or layered branch roofing integration with existing landform where possible. The costs ranged from $4 to $11, depending on what each family needed to purchase versus what they could collect, and in no case did the finished structure cost more than 1/3 of what a conventional milled lumber shed would have run. She did not think of this as teaching. She thought of it as answering questions people had already arrived at through their own necessity. The questions she answered had been forming in these families since the first cold morning of September, and she simply had the answers at a time when the answers mattered. Whether anyone would have arrived at the same answers without her, she couldn't say. She only knew that the answers existed and that she had them, and that the winter coming was the kind that didn't negotiate. The dugout was livable by the 5th of November. She'd roofed it with pine poles covered in bark and sod, installed the 3-legged stove with its rock base, hung a blanket over the entry that she'd later replaced with a board door. The interior measured 4 feet by 8 feet with a standing height of 5.5 feet at the center ridge, which was enough if she didn't stand in the middle more than briefly. It was objectively a hole in the earth with a fire in it. It was also, she had calculated, the single most thermally efficient shelter design available to someone with her resources in this climate. The earth maintained a consistent temperature of approximately 48 degrees at depth, regardless of what the air above was doing. A fire running for 3 hours in the morning brought the interior to 65, and it held there for the better part of the day. A small fire in the evening before sleep maintained it through the night without further attention. The split pine from her woodshed, dry and clean, produced no creosote buildup, no smoke accumulation, none of the slow carbon poisoning that killed people in poorly ventilated spaces with wet wood. She slept better in that hole than she had in the cabin she'd shared with Heinrich for 11 years. She was not sure what to make of that and decided not to make anything of it. The cold deepened through November in the graduated way that good cold did not an ambush, but a steady advance each morning, a degree or two lower than the one before the creek. Ice moving from the edges toward the center, the high country going white, and the tree line following the white down the slope day by day. On the 12th of November, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees below zero overnight. She woke to a world that had been reorganized by cold into something simpler and more demanding. She started the stove from a handful of birch bark and 2 small pine splits and had the space at 58 degrees in 40 minutes. She was ready for what was coming. The question that arrived with the Halverson family on the 19th of November was whether the 4 cords of dry pine in her hillside woodshed were going to be enough for more than one person's survival. That question had an answer, and she already knew it. What arrived on the 12th of November was not announced by the yellow-gray clouds of a rain system. It came as a pressure change, a density in the air that preceded the sky's visible commitment, the barometric drop that her father had described as the mountain holding its breath before it decided what to do next. By evening, the temperature was falling at a rate she hadn't experienced since the winter of 1872, dropping through the teens towards single digits with the mechanical certainty of something that had made up its mind. She checked every seal on the dugout entry. She checked the woodshed door. She added a second rock to the windward base of the burlap to hold it tight against the bottom of the frame. Then she went inside the dugout and did not go out again until morning. 8 degrees below zero at first light. The creek had stopped talking. Ice had locked it from bank to bank sometime before midnight. Not the thin edge ice of the early cold snaps, but full channel ice, thick enough to walk on, the kind that formed when water temperature and air temperature had been in sustained negotiation, and the air had won conclusively. 6 inches of snow lay over everything, which was not itself alarming, but the snow had a particular dry density that said more was coming behind it. The sky to the northwest had the flat white uniformity of a system with more material to deliver than it had delivered. She started the stove with birch bark and 2 pine splits. The wood catching, without the hesitation that wet wood produced, the flame moving clean and yellow rather than the blue-orange of burning moisture. The interior came up to 52 degrees in 35 minutes, which was enough. She made cornmeal porridge and ate it standing because sitting required getting back down to the floor, and the floor was the coldest part of the space. She was dressed in her boat before the stove was lit. She would be dressed in her coat until April, unless something specific required otherwise. The wind off the Continental Divide arrived mid-morning. It came from the northwest at a sustained speed she estimated from how it moved the cottonwood crowns and the behavior of loose snow on the flat ground near the creek at somewhere between 50 and 60 miles per hour. In the draws above the canyon where the terrain funneled and accelerated airflow, it would be worse. She had heard that wind in the Black Forest as a child in different trees at a different latitude, and her body recognized the pitch of it before her mind had processed the information, a low, continuous roar that sat at the bottom of the audible range and seemed to come from everywhere at once rather than from any specific direction. The Helena Road closed before noon. She knew this not from observation, but from the absence of the freight wagon sounds she'd grown accustomed to hearing at predictable intervals. When Frank Dillard's wagon stopped moving, the road was impassable. He didn't stop moving for minor inconveniences. She spent the morning inside close to the stove doing the small maintenance tasks that kept a subsistence winter functional, repairing a split in the left boot sole with a strip of rawhide she'd been saving for exactly this purpose, restitching a seam on her coat's right sleeve where the thread had weakened from repeated wet-dry cycling. She worked with the systematic patience of someone who understood that small failures attended to early cost of nothing, and small failures ignored compounded into catastrophes. The stitching took 40 minutes. The boot repair took 20. The wind outside did not let up. At midday, she opened the dugout entry and looked out. The snow was moving horizontally more than vertically, driven by the wind into long streamers that followed the terrain contours, building drifts against anything vertical and leaving scoured bare patches on any surface that faced northwest. The woodshed from her angle was invisible beneath the general whiteness of the hillside, not buried but camouflaged. The dome shape sat below the level of the drifting, and the bark roof carried no accumulation because the wind was moving too fast across it to allow anything to settle. She watched for 10 minutes, then closed the entry back up. The three households she could see from her position: two cabins on the east side of the creek and one larger structure that served as a combined dwelling and storage building for a family named Corbett, who'd been in the Helena area since 1871, were all smoking from their chimneys in the particular way of fires that were being pushed hard. Heavy smoke from green or wet wood. The Corbett chimney, which she'd observed often enough to know its normal output, was running twice as dark as usual, which meant either they were burning wood that hadn't dried adequately or they were burning it in a stove that needed cleaning. Either way, they were working harder for less heat than the fire should have been producing. In a storm that was holding below zero, that inefficiency had a cost measured in warmth that didn't arrive, and wood that disappeared faster than planned. Her own stove was burning at a third of that intensity and holding the space at a temperature that, while not comfortable by any external standard, was entirely survivable and required no more wood than she'd planned for. The dry pine performed exactly as dry pine was supposed to perform. The math of it was simple, and the math was working. She did not feel superior about this. She felt the specific relief of someone whose calculation has proven correct in a situation where incorrect calculations had permanent consequences. There was a difference between those two states, and she knew which one she was in. The storm ran for 3 days in total, though the worst of it was concentrated in the first 36 hours. The snow accumulation by the time it passed was 14 inches on flat ground and considerably more in any location where the terrain had allowed drifting. The Helena Road reopened on the morning of the 15th, and Frank Dillard's wagon was audible before 9 o'clock, which meant he'd been moving before full light. He had deliveries that couldn't wait, and he knew the road better than the road knew itself. She spent the day after the storm opened doing the assessment circuit she'd established as standard practice woodshed, first in the structural check on the dugout roof, then the conditions of the pine supply in the upper draws to confirm that the next cutting run would yield what she needed. The woodshed had performed without event. The bark roof had taken the storm's full force on the windward face and showed surface weathering, darkening slight compression of the outer bark layer that was entirely cosmetic. The dome shape had given the wind nothing to push against and everything to slide across. The clay walls had developed a fine surface network of hairline cracks in 2 places on the windward face, neither of which penetrated to depth, in which she addressed with fresh clay and dry grass pressed in and smoothed over in 20 minutes. The wood stack inside was unchanged. This was by now what she expected. Expectation and evidence were not the same thing, and the evidence continued to accumulate. Cal Rourke stopped by in the early afternoon with 2 men she hadn't seen before, a pair of brothers named Alderman, who were running a small coal supplementation operation northeast of town, and had been in a running argument apparently about whether their current wood storage arrangement would hold through the rest of the winter. The older brother believed it would. The younger brother had his doubts. They'd come to Cal for an opinion, and Cal had redirected them to her. She showed them what they asked to see. The younger brother, whose name was Thomas, and who was perhaps 30, with the particular lean hunger of someone who'd been doing physical work since he was old enough to be useful, asked questions that were specific and practical and showed he'd been thinking about the problem for longer than the current argument. The older brother, James, listened with the slightly defensive posture of someone whose position is being challenged, but who is also genuinely interested in the information. She answered both of them in the same register without condescension in either direction, without performing expertise, simply describing what she'd done and why, and what outcomes she'd observed. The critical issue is not whether your current structure keeps water out in normal conditions, she told them. It's whether it keeps water out when temperature and precipitation are working together against it simultaneously. Most storage failures happen at the point where two stresses coincide, not where either stress acts alone. Thomas turned that over. The corner where the milled lumber roof meets the side wall, that's where I've seen water get in when rain comes with freeze behind it. Because the lumber and the roofing material expand and contract at different rates. The junction moves. Clay doesn't have that problem because the whole wall moves as one material. James looked at his brother with an expression that conceded the argument without saying so directly. They left with enough information to address their actual problem, which was a junction failure on the northeast corner of their existing shed, and Astrid returned to her splitting work. The wood supply question was by the middle of November resolved in her favor. She had enough to get through to late March without rationing beyond the standard careful management she applied as a matter of practice. If March came in hard, she could extend by reducing the evening fire and relying more fully on the dugout's thermal mass through the night. She had built the system with margin because systems without margin eventually met the condition their margin was designed to handle, and then they failed. What she did not have margin for was what arrived on the 19th of November. Frank Dillard brought the information with the same neutral delivery he applied to weather reports and road conditions, stopping his wagon at the point along the creek path where she was stacking an additional half cord she'd cut from a draw newly accessible since the storm had knocked down a screen of small trees. His voice carried no editorial. A family had come in on the afternoon train, man, woman, 3 children, the woman visibly pregnant. They had nothing. The man was sick. They'd been directed to the church. She knew without asking for details what kind of sick. She'd heard that cough in Heinrich's chest for the last 4 months of his life, recognized it by its texture, the dry depth of it, the way it came from a level below where ordinary illness lived. She'd known what it meant in Heinrich, and she'd watched it anyway week by week and been right about what it meant. There was no comfort in being right about that kind of thing. There was only the knowledge. She found Britta Halverson in the church basement that evening. The space was low-ceilinged and smelled of cold stone and old ash from a fireplace that had not been cleaned since the previous winter. A single lamp hung from a hook near the entry and threw more shadow than light. The 3 children were arranged on the floor in the corner farthest from the door, sharing 2 thin blankets, the oldest one sitting upright with the youngest leaning against her, in the particular configuration of children who've learned to conserve warmth through proximity. Otto lay on a plank bed along the right wall with his eyes closed and his breathing audible from the doorway. Not labored exactly, but conscious the breath of a body that was working at something. Britta was sitting on the floor beside Otto's plank, with her back against the wall and her hands folded over the full roundness of her belly. She wasn't doing anything. She was simply sitting in the way of someone who has exhausted the available actions and is now in the inventory phase, taking stock of what remains when everything that could be done has been done. She was 34 years old. She had the bone structure of someone who'd been healthy and capable before circumstances had spent those reserves over a period of months, the kind of depletion that showed not in any single feature, but in the overall economy of the face, the way it had nothing left to hold in reserve. Her eyes, when she looked up at the sound of Astrid's entrance, were clear and direct and not particularly hopeful, which was not despair, but something more functional than despair, the gaze of someone who had made a clear-eyed accounting of their situation and was neither dramatizing it nor pretending it was other than it was. Astrid stood in the middle of the basement floor and asked, "How much firewood do you have?" Britta's voice, when it came, was steady in the way of people who've stopped spending energy on the performance of stability because they need the energy for actual stability. Maybe 2 weeks if we're very careful. Otto hasn't been able to cut for 6 weeks. There's no money to buy more. You need 4 cords minimum to make it to April. I know. A pause. I don't know who would sell to us on any terms we could meet. The three children in the corner had gone quiet in the way of children who've learned that adult conversations about resources require stillness. The oldest Ira watched Astrid with the particular attention of a 7-year-old who has understood more of the family's situation than the adults realize and is processing it in real time. Nils sat beside her with his chin on his knees. Sigrid was asleep against Era's shoulder, her mouth slightly open, her breathing the uncomplicated breathing of a child who hasn't yet learned to make sleep complicated. Astrid looked at them for a moment. Then, I need workers. I'm building 2 additional storage structures before spring, one for root vegetables, one for tools and equipment. I'm paying in firewood instead of cash because cash is what I don't have either. A day's stacking work from your children buys a week's worth of splits. They stack I cut. Does that seem reasonable? Britta looked at her with the expression of someone receiving something they have needed badly and recognizing the exact form it's taken. She knew what was happening. The accounting was transparent. A 7-year-old's stacking capacity for a day was worth perhaps 2 hours of adult labor, not a week of split pine. The discrepancy between the offered exchange rate and the actual exchange rate was the gift, and both women understood this simultaneously, and neither of them commented on it because commenting on it would have changed its nature. More than reasonable. Britta's voice held something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite relief, something in between those things that didn't have a common word attached to it. More than I have a right to expect from anyone. You have every right to expect help when you need it. Astrid said, her voice carrying the flatness of someone stating a physical constant rather than a moral position. The only question is whether it arrives. She left the basement and walked back along the creek path in the dark, her boots finding the familiar ground by habit rather than sight. The temperature was 11 degrees. The stars were the dense, specific population of a Montana winter sky, arranged with the indifference of objects that have no opinion about what happens below them. She went over the numbers on the walk home. Her current supply, 3 cords and 6 weeks of additional cutting at her current pace, which would put her at approximately 4.5 cords by the time deep cold prevented further accumulation. Her own requirement through April, 2.5 cords with normal winter severity, 3 with the severe winter the almanac predicted. That left a margin of 1 to 1.5 cords that she could redirect without putting herself at material risk, provided she maintained her cutting pace and the weather didn't close the draws earlier than she'd planned for. The Halverson family needed 4 cords. She could provide 1 to 1.5 without compromising her own situation, which meant she needed to cut aggressively, and the children needed to stack aggressively, and the additional storage structures she told Britta about needed to actually exist, which meant she needed to build them. The story she'd told it in the basement was not a fiction. It had been a decision made in the moment of telling it that became true by being stated. She started cutting additional wood the following morning before the Halverson children came for the first time. The draw she'd been working in had a good stand of lodgepole that the storm had partially opened by dropping 3 larger trees across its entrance, creating a windfall that was easier to access than the standing timber above. She worked through the morning, splitting and setting aside the pieces she was accumulating for the Halverson stack, noting their weight and density by Phil choosing the splits that would burn efficiently in a large space with children and a sick man and a pregnant woman, the kind of fire that needed to be reliable and clean and able to run low without going out. Era came first on the afternoon of the 20th. She arrived alone, having left Nils watching Sigrid and Otto sleeping, and she introduced herself with the particular formality of a child who has been taught manners as a form of armor. She was small for 7, with her mother's clear eyes and a seriousness of expression that sat oddly on a face that young, not unhappy, but calibrated as though she had already learned to spend her emotional resources carefully. Astrid showed her the stack and explained the system. Large pieces first flat, face down tight enough that nothing wobbled, but not so tight that air couldn't move between them. Second layer perpendicular to the first. Third layer parallel to the first. The alternating pattern created a stack with internal structural integrity. It wouldn't lean, wouldn't collapse under its own weight, wouldn't develop the hot spots of tightly packed wood that prevented adequate drying. She demonstrated with 3 pieces and then handed the fourth to Era and watched her attempt it. The child placed the piece and looked at it critically, adjusted it a quarter inch, checked it against the adjacent piece, adjusted again. The air gap needs to be consistent, Era said to herself more than to Astrid. Otherwise, some pieces dry faster than others, and the stack isn't uniform. Astrid looked at her. Where did you learn that? From what you just said. A pause. Is it right? Yes, it's right. Era went back to stacking with the focused attention of someone who had found a problem they could actually solve and was fully committed to solving it correctly. Nils arrived an hour later with Sigrid bundled against his back in a sling their mother had fashioned from a shawl. He set his sister down on a flat rock in a sheltered spot with a piece of pine bark to examine and joined his sister at the stack. Nils was 6 and approached the work differently than Era. Where she moved methodically, he moved quickly, and then stopped to assess making adjustments in batches rather than piece by piece. The results were equivalent. Sigrid from her rock watched everything with the wide attention of a 4-year-old who is filing information she doesn't yet have categories for. The week that followed established a pattern. Mornings Astrid cut, afternoons the children stacked. She taught them what she taught them, not as formal instruction, but as embedded commentary on what they were already doing. Here's why this works better than that. Here's what the wood is telling you. If you pay attention to how it weighs versus how it looks, here's the difference between what you can see and what you need to feel for. Era absorbed everything verbally. Niels absorbed everything physically through repetition until his hands knew what his mind was still working out. Sigrid, who was too small for the heavy pieces, arranged kindling by size with a seriousness that suggested she had decided this was her assigned role in the operation, and she intended to execute it without cutting corners. The pine came down from the draws in accumulating stacks, and the stacks migrated from Astrid's site to a corner of the church basement, and the corner of the church basement gradually developed the organized density of a wood supply that would last. William Hart appeared on the 28th of November, 4 days after he'd heard from Davis that Astrid was running what he described as a wood supply operation with child labor and a pregnant Norwegian woman somehow at the center of it, which was not quite accurate, but was accurate enough that Hart understood the general shape of what was happening. He looked at the basement corner where the Halverson wood was accumulating a cord and a quarter at that point stacked with the consistent gaps and alternating layers that the children had been taught, and looked at the children stacking and then at Astrid splitting outside and put it together without needing it explained. He didn't comment on the arrangement directly. Instead, he spent 2 hours helping Astrid fell. In section 3 of the larger lodge poles in the upper draw his strength and experience, accelerating the work in a way that added perhaps a half cord's worth of material to the afternoon output. When he left without discussion of payment or reciprocity, which was its own form of statement. Frank Diller left a 20-pound sack of dried beans on the splitting rock on the 2nd of December. No note. She added it to the Halverson supplies. Ruth Garfield appeared on the 5th with her daughter Emma, who was 9 and had apparently been told something about what was happening because she arrived with the specific purpose of a child who has been given a task and takes it seriously. Emma joined the stacking crew without introduction and worked alongside Era for 2 hours before her mother called her back. Ruth left a jar of preserved plums and a small cotton sack of dried sage, both of which she pressed into Astrid's hands without ceremony on her way out. The Reverend Marsh came by on the 8th of December mid-morning while Astrid was in the draw and the children were working at the stack unsupervised. He stood at a distance and watched them for several minutes. She saw him from the upper draw in her second return with a load and observed without giving any sign of having done so. He stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, during which the children continued to work with complete indifference to his presence. Era glanced at him once and then returned to the stack. Niels didn't look up at all. Sigrid waved at him from her kindling arrangement and with the uninhibited social confidence of a 4-year-old, and he appeared to not know what to do with this and then gave a small, stiff wave back. He was gone by the time Astrid descended from the draw with her load. The pattern he'd established in October, the quiet campaign of implication and social distance that had caused a portion of his congregation to hold Astrid at arm's length, had been continuing through November. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the wind direction as a consistent environmental condition that influenced what she could do and where she could do it, not as a personal affront requiring a personal response. The women who'd pulled back had done so because Marsh was their pastor, and his opinion carried weight in their daily lives, and his disapproval was a cost they preferred not to pay. She understood this. She did not hold it against them. She held it against nothing. What she understood with the clarity that came from watching communities in crisis was that people generally behaved according to their incentives, and when the incentives changed, people changed with them. Marsh's incentive to undermine her had been at the beginning about establishing that social order required institutional mediation, that a woman in her situation required the church's guidance and support, that attempting to operate outside that structure was inappropriate and likely to fail. The woodshed had not failed. The wood supply operation for the Halverson family was visible to anyone who walked past the church basement on a weekday afternoon. The calculus was shifting. She did not rush it. She split wood. On the 14th of December, Cal Rourke came with a man she hadn't met before, a land audit from the territorial office in Helena, who was compiling documentation on frontier building techniques for a report to the territorial government on cost-effective construction methods for new settlement areas. His name was Patterson, and he was methodical and careful, carrying a small leather-bound journal and asking questions that were specific and technical and showed genuine knowledge of construction, rather than the superficial curiosity of someone writing for a general audience. She answered his questions with the same completeness she brought to any technical conversation. He asked about load distribution in the arch system. She explained the compressive geometry and why a semicircle distributed load laterally rather than vertically. He asked about the thermal properties of the earth-sheltered rear wall. She explained the thermal mass principle, the rock's capacity to absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, functioning as a buffer between the fire cycle and the air temperature cycle. He asked about the clay compound's behavior through repeated freeze-thaw cycles. She described the fiber reinforcement mechanism that Hart had confirmed and what she'd observed in the post-storm inspection. Patterson wrote in his journal steadily through all of it. At the end, he asked, if someone were building a settlement structure from nothing in this territory with minimal capital to say under $10, what would you build first? A dugout for living, then a covered wood storage on this design. In that order, because your survival timeline is fuel before shelter, at least in this climate. She paused. But build the wood storage first if you can, because you'll need the fuel before the dugout is finished. He looked up from his journal. That seems counterintuitive. Most correct things do until they aren't. He wrote that down. She wasn't sure what the territorial report would eventually say, or whether anything she'd told him would survive the translation from conversation to official document, but she recognized that information moving into institutional channels had a different persistence than information moving through community word of mouth. Both mattered. They moved at different speeds, and they moved through different networks, and they accumulated in different forms, but they accumulated. The Halverson wood supply reached 4 cords on the 20th of December. She knew this because Era counted in a voice that was careful and precise, and then looked at her mother when she announced the number, and Britta, who was sitting near Otto's plank with her hands folded, closed her eyes briefly and then opened them again, and nodded once without speaking. Otto's breathing had changed over the course of the month. Not dramatically, not the sudden deterioration she'd witnessed in Heinrich, but in the way of a slow tide going out each breath, spending a little more effort for a little less return. He was awake for longer stretches now than he'd been in November, which was not improvement, but the particular alertness that sometimes came when a body was concentrating its remaining resources in a way that wasn't sustainable, but was for the moment vivid. She visited the basement on the 23rd of December. Otto was awake and sitting partially upright against the wall. He looked at her with eyes that had the quality she'd seen in Heinrich's face in the last weeks. Not resigned exactly, more like settled, as though the primary argument had concluded, and what remained was the administrative work of the ending. His voice when he spoke had thinned since she'd first seen him, a sound made more from breath than from resonance. His words carried the weight of someone spending them from a supply that was limited. "You've been keeping my family alive. Your children have been keeping your family's wood supply organized. That's not nothing. It's not the same thing, and you know it." He looked at the ceiling of the basement for a moment. "I built things. Before all this, I was good at it." "What did you build?" "Barns, mostly. Some houses. A mill near Eau Claire." A breath. "I would have liked to see what you built." "Era can show you the principles. She understands the whole system." Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile but occupied the territory adjacent to one. She would. Astrid left him sitting upright. She did not see him awake again. The weeks between the 20th of December and the 8th of January were the coldest sustained period of the winter. The temperature held below zero for 12 consecutive days at its low point, the kind of cold that tested every seal on every structure, found every thermal bridge, made firewood, not a comfort, but the physical boundary between being alive and not being alive. The wood supply in the basement corner burned at a controlled rate each day, consuming what the day required, and no more the stack diminishing in the way of a well-managed resource rather than the ragged way of an inadequate one. The three Halverson children understood what the wood stack represented in a way that only children who've been cold understand it, not abstractly, not as a general principle, but in their bodies as a specific warmth that a specific piece of wood in a specific stove would produce, and the calculation of how many pieces stood between their mother's pregnancy and the kind of cold that complicated everything. They did not take single pieces casually. They closed the basement door behind them. When Sigrid on one occasion left it open because her arms were full of kindling, she came back and closed it herself without being reminded and stood looking at it for a moment as though confirming the decision. Otto Halverson died on the 8th of January, 1877, in the early hours before first light. Britta woke to the change in his breathing and sat beside him until it stopped, and then sat beside him after it stopped with the stillness of someone who has been preparing for a thing and finds when it arrives that preparation and the actual event are not the same experience at all. The children slept through it. Britta let them sleep. Reverend Marsh was notified at first light and came to the basement with his Bible and his particular expression of ministerial solemnity. He performed the appropriate rites with the care and precision he brought to all official functions. He was in this context entirely correct in his conduct, percent-measured experience in the particular territory of grief that required witness rather than intervention. He read from the 34th Psalm, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted." His voice in the cold basement was steady and resonant. The children sat together against the wall. Nils and Sigrid pressed against Era's sides, all three, with the particular stillness of children in the presence of something too large for their current vocabulary. Astrid stood near the door. She had come because Britta had asked her to come, a brief message delivered by Era at first light with the directness of a child executing a task. She stood and listened to Marsh read and watched his face and saw in it something that was not visible in his public expressions, the particular complexity of a man who is performing a role he genuinely believes in, while simultaneously aware that the room he is performing it in exists in its current state because of actions he had spent months working against. The wood stack in the corner, still almost 2 cords deep, visible from where he stood. The children warm in their inadequate coats, but warm. He did not look at the wood stack directly, but he did not avoid it entirely either. His eyes moved past it twice briefly without settling. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired and sad and aware of the specific weight of a winter that had been carrying this outcome in it since the first morning she'd heard that cough. Vindication required an opponent, and she had never had one. She'd had a problem and a set of resources and a deadline, and she'd solved the problem inside the deadline with the resources available, and that solution had extended itself to include people it hadn't originally been designed to include, which was not heroism but geometry. If you build a structure sound enough, it can hold more than the minimum it was designed for. Otto Halverson had been 41 years old. His family had enough wood to last until April. She did not stay long after the service. Britta walked her to the basement door, moving with the deliberate care of someone carrying 7 months of pregnancy through grief simultaneously, and thanked her in a way that had no performance in it. Not the elaborated gratitude of someone who wants their thanks to be visibly adequate to what they were thanking for, but the simple acknowledgement of one person to another that something real had happened between them. Astrid walked back to the creek in the gray January morning and went directly to the draw and cut wood for 4 hours, because the wood needed cutting and because physical work was the form of processing that her body had always trusted over the alternatives. The days after Otto's death moved in the particular rhythm of a community, absorbing a loss, the small adjustments that followed the reconfigurations of who took which responsibilities. The way Era quietly assumed a position of household management that was too large for a 7-year-old and too necessary to refuse. She organized the basement's daily wood consumption with the systematic attention she'd brought to the stacking work, accounting for the difference in heat requirement between a clear night and a cloudy one, between a day when Britta was active and a day when she needed to rest, calibrating the fire's intensity to the day's actual requirement, rather than to a fixed daily ration. She was doing in miniature exactly what Astrid had been doing since September, managing resources by close observation of actual conditions rather than by formula. Astrid noticed this and said nothing about it directly. She gave Era small additional information when she visited how to tell when a stove needed its ash cleared by the change in the draft sound, how a fire that's starved of air produces different smoke than a fire that's starved of fuel, what the sound of ice in the flue meant and what it didn't mean. She gave the information in the same embedded contextual way she'd given it during the stacking work, as commentary on what was already happening, not as formal instruction. Era filed everything without visible reaction and deployed it later accurately in the situations it applied to. On the 14th of January, Ruth Garfield came to the church basement with her daughter Emma and a pot of venison stew, heavy enough that both of them were needed to carry it. This was not a dramatic gesture, it was a routine one, the way that communities in shared difficulty move food between households when someone was unable to produce their own. But the fact of it was a marker. Ruth had been one of the women who'd held Astrid at arm's length through the autumn, influenced by Marcia's quiet campaign of implication. She was now delivering food to the family that Astrid had kept alive through the winter. The route from October to January had passed through several invisible reckonings that Ruth had conducted in private and arrived at without announcement. She stayed for an hour, sitting with Britta and talking about what came after. Not philosophically, practically. Britta had the skills to teach, having worked as a schoolroom assistant in Wisconsin before the move. Helena had children who needed teaching in a community that valued literacy in the way that communities in uncertain situations valued literacy as the skill that enabled all the other skills. Ruth knew a family on the north side of town with 3 children and no school closer than 6 miles. She knew 2 other families in similar situations. The conversation between the 2 women moved with quiet efficiency through the practical landscape of what was possible, and Astrid sat near the door and listened without participating because she was not needed in this particular exchange, and she knew it. The wood stack by the 15th of January stood at a cord and a half. The winter had another 2 months in it, at minimum, possibly closer to 3, if the season extended into a late spring. A cord and a half for 3 people and an expected newborn through February and March was manageable with careful use but had no margin. She cut an additional half cord and had Ira and Neil stack it in the basement corner during the week of the 17th, which brought the reserve to something she was comfortable with. The children worked with the steady efficiency of people for whom this task had become ordinary rather than exceptional, which was its own form of success. The cold broke briefly in the last week of January. Not a full thaw, but a warming trend that brought the temperature above freezing for 4 consecutive afternoons and created the specific misery of a midwinter partial melt. Water ran under the ice on the creek and over the surface of the snowpack and refroze each night into a crust that made movement treacherous. The Helena Road became passable again, and then became a skating surface, and then became passable again in a cycle that Frank Dillard navigated with the steady pragmatism of someone who'd been doing it for years and had no philosophical objections to difficulty. He stopped at her site on the 28th to tell her that Patterson, the land agent from the territorial office, had submitted his report with a substantial section on low-cost construction methods and had cited the woven sapling woodshed design, specifically including a schematic that a territorial drafter had prepared based on Patterson's notes and the measurements he'd taken during his December visit. The report had been forwarded to the territorial governor's office and would Patterson believe be distributed to land agents managing new homestead areas in the spring. She thought about that while she worked. The information would now move through institutional channels rather than community ones, moving faster over distance, more slowly through the individual judgment of each reader, accumulating in a form that survived the death of anyone particular and could be reproduced without the need for the original source to be present. This was different from what Cal Rourke had done by bringing men to see the woodshed, different from what Frank Dillard had done by telling the story along his supply routes, different from what Hart had done by explaining it to Davis. All of those transmissions depended on individuals who had seen the thing and chose to describe it. The territorial report didn't require anyone to have seen it. It required only literacy and access, which were more broadly distributed. She was not sentimental about this. Sentiment was a form of spending that she could rarely afford. But she noted the fact of it, the way a practical solution, once sufficiently demonstrated, began to move through channels she had not created and could not control, developing a life independent of the person who'd originated it. Cal appeared in early February with the news that the Helena Weekly Herald was working on a brief item about frontier construction methods following the circulation of Patterson's preliminary report in the local professional community. The reporter, a young man named Sykes, who covered civic and commercial affairs, had been asking around about examples of practical innovation in the settlement community. Cal had told him with careful vagueness about a barrel-vaulted wood storage structure of woven willow and clay that had been built on the creek for under $7 and had outperformed conventional milled lumber sheds through the worst winter in a decade. He had not provided a name. She did not ask him to. She understood what Sykes would write and what the Herald would print, which was a description without attribution, the common form for stories about women's practical work in that era when the work itself was notable enough to record, but the source of it was considered either irrelevant or socially complicated in ways the editors preferred not to navigate. The record would exist. The name attached to it would not. She had made her peace with this trade-off before it was offered. February moved through its second half with the grinding patience of a season that had been making the same argument for 3 months and saw no reason to stop. The temperature held in the single digits most mornings, climbing to the low 20s on the best afternoons, and the snow that had fallen in November was still present in most places, compressed by its own accumulated weight into a layer of ice-crusted pack that crunched underfoot with the sound of something permanent. The creek remained locked. The cottonwoods along its banks had the skeletal clarity of trees that have given up everything unnecessary and are existing on reserves their crowns against the white sky like diagrams of themselves rather than living things. Astrid had seen this stage of winter in Montana before and knew what it meant. The worst was past, but past was not finished, and the distance between past and finished was where people made the mistakes that March punished. She cut wood every morning that the weather permitted, not because she needed more for herself, but because Britta Halverson's wood supply needed to carry not just the remainder of winter, but the cold shoulder of early spring, which in Montana could run another 6 weeks past the calendar's claim of seasonal change. The baby Astrid Autoline was born on the 1st of February. She arrived at 6:47 in the evening after a labor that ran through the afternoon, difficult but without the complications that a hard winter, a grieving body in a cold basement might have conspired to produce. Britta worked through it with the same closed-down focus she'd brought to everything since October, as though she had decided that this particular piece of work required everything she had, and she was prepared to give it. The midwife from the east side of town, who'd served 3 seasons in that role, reported throughout the afternoon that what was happening was difficult. The baby was small but arrived with the full volume announcement of a healthy set of lungs and the pink-faced outrage of someone who has strong opinions about the conditions into which they've been delivered. The basement was warm. The stove was burning dry pine at a measured rate. Outside, the temperature was 11 degrees and dropping toward the single digits again after the brief thaw. Inside, there was a lamp burning and Era holding Nils's hand and cigarette asleep in the corner, having refused until the last 10 minutes to acknowledge that anything unusual was occurring. Britta held her daughter and looked at her with the expression that followed the end of the largest effort a body could be asked to make. Not relief exactly, not joy exactly, but the settling that came after both of those had passed through. She looked at Astrid across the dim room. Astrid for the first name, a pause. Autoline for the middle, for her father. Astrid looked at the baby. She had been named for 2 people she had never been named for before in her life. Not in Germany, not in 20 years in Montana, not in 41 years of being herself. The infant Astrid Autoline Halverson had no opinion about this, as yet being occupied with more immediate concerns. The name would have to do its work on her later, when she was old enough to carry it. Cal Rourke stood in the basement doorway, hat in hands, having arrived sometime in the previous hour, without anyone particularly arranging for him to be there. He looked at the baby with the particular expression of an engineer, confronting something that his professional frameworks did not fully account for. Frank Dillard was behind him, visible in the outer darkness of the doorway, not quite entering but not absent either. Reverend Marsh arrived last entering with the careful movement of someone navigating a space that has established its own emotional geography and requires respect for that geography, regardless of whether you help create it. He stood at the edge of the lamp's reach and looked at the baby and then at Britta, and then briefly not long enough to constitute anything as formal as an acknowledgement, but long enough to be intentional at Astrid. He did not speak. He did not need to. The winter had made all the necessary arguments on behalf of everyone in the room, and Marsh was underneath the theological convictions in the social conservatism, a man who could read evidence when the evidence was direct enough and sustained enough and surrounded him on all sides in a cold basement with a newborn baby as its most recent point of data. The conclusions were not comfortable. He reached them anyway. Ira fell asleep against the wall an hour later, with Sigrid on one side and Nils on the other, all 3 of them breathing in the slow rhythm of children who are warm enough and safe enough and have decided collectively that the night has done what it needed to do. Astrid sat near the stove and fed it the measured amounts it required and watched the fire's light move on the ceiling and thought about 4 cords of dry wood and a pocket watch that kept time poorly, and a hillside alcove that had looked to most people who'd seen it in September like a failure waiting to happen. The baby slept against Britta's chest with the complete trust of someone who has not yet learned the other options. Outside, Montana held its cold. Inside, the fire burned clean, and the wood lasted. On the 17th of February, Reverend Marsh came to the woodshed site. Not to the church basement, not to a neutral location. He came to where she was working, which required him to walk south along the creek path to the specific location that he had 4 months earlier, pronounced inappropriate for a Christian woman. He arrived mid-morning while she was doing the clay maintenance she'd scheduled for the week. Fresh compound worked into the handful of surface cracks that the freeze-thaw cycling had opened since November, pressed in with her thumb and smooth flat and left to cure in the cold air. He stood at the standard distance and watched her work for a while without announcing himself, which she was aware of from the moment he arrived. When he finally spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before in her dealings with him. Not humble exactly, because Marsh was constitutionally resistant to the full architecture of humility, but something in that neighborhood, something that acknowledged a weight he'd been carrying and was setting down in the only way available to him, which was to show up and speak directly. "Mrs. Voss, I've been thinking about what I said to you in September." She continued working the clay. "A lot has happened since September." "Yes." A pause of the length that suggested he'd prepared something and was deciding whether to use it. "I told you that this structure was inappropriate, that it would fail. I implied that the congregation's assistance represented the only reasonable path available to you." Another pause. "I was wrong on all counts." She turned then because the statement deserved direct engagement. He met her eyes with the discomfort of someone who is doing the correct thing and finding that correct things are not necessarily comfortable things. She let the silence hold for a moment before she responded, not to extend his discomfort, but because the words she chose mattered, and she was choosing them carefully. "You were working with the information you had," she said, "and the assumptions that came with it." "My assumptions were wrong." He said it plainly without elaboration, which was more than she'd expected from him, and she acknowledged it internally. The Halverson family is alive and has a new child and a mother who is making plans for their future. The church's role in it was to provide a cold room and tell them they couldn't stay past Christmas. The words were not self-flagellating, they were accurate, and he delivered them as accuracy rather than penance. "I told people things about you that I believed at the time and that the evidence has since refuted. I'm telling you directly because I told those people directly and because you're owed the acknowledgement." She looked at him for a moment longer. He held the look without deflecting. "Thank you," she said finally. "That's more than most people manage." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked back toward town. She watched him go and then turned back to the claywork. The crack under her thumb was 3 inches long and perhaps a 1/4 inch deep, running along the course where 2 clay applications from different sessions had joined imperfectly. She packed fresh compound in and worked it to a surface match and held her palm flat against it for 30 seconds to press the bond. When she removed her hand, the repair was invisible. The Helena Weekly Herald ran its item on the 3rd of March, as Cal had indicated it would. Sykes had written 3 paragraphs placed on the 3rd page below a story about the territorial legislature and above a notice about spring road conditions. The paragraphs described in the measured prose of a reporter who was genuinely interested in the subject and competent enough to describe it accurately the barrel-vaulted structures of woven willow and daub clay that had appeared along the creek drainage southeast of Helena, their construction cost, their performance through the winter, and the spread of the technique to other properties in the area. The article mentioned that the design had been developed by certain industrious residents of the Helena community, plural and ungendered, which was the form the Herald's editor preferred for stories of this type. She read it in the reading room at the Mercantile on 3rd Street, standing at the counter where the week's papers were laid out for customers. She read it twice. The description was accurate, the measurements were right, the cost was right, the performance claim was calibrated correctly to what the winner had actually demonstrated rather than overclaiming. She suspected William Hart had been Sykes's source based on the professional precision of the technical details, but she didn't know and didn't ask. She set the paper back on the counter and bought a pound of dried beans and walked home. The weeks that followed the Herald item converged with the Patterson report moving through territorial channels and the network of people who'd seen the woodshed telling the story in their own words for 5 months. These three streams merged in March into something that had more current than any one of them separately. Three men came from Deer Lodge in the third week of March. They'd been told about the barrel vault technique by a freighter who'd heard about it from someone in Helena, and they'd come specifically to learn it because they were planning a settlement expansion in a valley north of their current operations and needed low-cost storage solutions for the first season. She spent a full day with them, walking them through the site, the technique, the materials selection, the clay compound, the bark shingle method. They asked good questions, took notes on scraps of paper, and left with what they needed. A woman named Clara Hoskins arrived in early April, having ridden 60 miles from the south end of the territory, specifically because her husband's mining operation had failed, and they needed to rebuild their provisioning structure from near nothing before the next winter. Clara was 53, sturdy, with the direct manner of someone who hadn't ridden 60 miles to be handled carefully. Astrid spent 3 days with her going through not just the woodshed design, but the full system dugout construction, stove selection, and placement food storage principles, the sequence of priorities for building toward winter survival when capital was minimal and time was fixed. Clara listened to everything with the concentration of someone converting information directly into plans. On the last day, sitting near the fire in the dugout, Clara set her cup down and said what she'd been building toward for 3 days. "You should be charging for this. I've been receiving payment." Astrid gestured at the supplies on the shelf. "I mean real payment. This is a skill. You're charging in dried beans what a lawyer charges in dollars. Your knowledge has a value that the community hasn't properly accounted for, and if you let them keep undervaluing it, you're teaching them that it should be undervalued." She thought about that for a long time after Clara left, riding south on a horse that moved with the purposeful energy of an animal heading home. The argument had a structure she recognized. It was the same structure she'd applied to Britta's exchange rate, the same principle she'd been running since September in every transaction that involved her skills and other people's needs. She had been applying it outward to others and not applying it to herself. That was a form of inconsistency she hadn't noticed until Clara named it. The ground thawed in the second week of April. The creek broke up over 3 noisy days, the ice going out in chunks that accumulated downstream, and then cleared the water, running brown and fast and cold, carrying the winter's accumulated deposit toward the Missouri. The cottonwoods put out their first leaf buds, small and yellow-green, tentative, in the way of things that have decided to try again after a long abstention. The woodshed sat against the hillside and was unaffected by the thaw in any structural sense. The clay had cured to its final hardness over the winter, the willow frame had completed its seasoning, and was now fixed in its curved position as permanently as if it had been grown that way, and the bark roof's lower edges had developed a slight moss growth on the shaded side that was cosmetically interesting and structurally irrelevant. The firewood remaining inside 2 full cords from the peak supply, exactly what she'd calculated she'd use, was as dry as it had been in October. Britta Halverson stopped by that afternoon with the baby on her back in the shawl sling, and Era walking beside her. Britta had color in her face again, the specific color that returned when a body was no longer spending its reserves on crisis management and had begun to rebuild. She'd started teaching 3 children from the north side of Helena 4 mornings a week. The arrangement Ruth had helped broker in February, and the income was modest but reliable, which in her situation was the combination that mattered most. Ira walked the perimeter of the woodshed in the same way Cal Rourke had walked it in October, checking the wall surfaces, looking at the roof junctions, crouching to examine the base. When she came back around, she said, "The moss on the north side of the roof won't hurt it." "No," Astrid said. "It might help. Adds insulation." Era filed this without visible reaction, which was her standard response to information she intended to use. Britta looked at Astrid with the straightforward directness that had been her mode since the night they'd met in the basement. We're going to be all right." "I know," Astrid said. It wasn't reassurance. It was assessment made on the same evidentiary basis she used for everything else. The color in Britta's face, the steadiness in her voice, the small Astrid Ottoline asleep against her back, and the 7-year-old walking the perimeter of a woodshed with professional attention. In May, she began taking on the work that Clara had pushed her toward, consulting on storage and shelter construction for homestead properties, charging a flat fee for a day's assessment and instruction. The fee structure was her own scale to what the family could pay, with a floor that represented her minimum. The point was to establish that the knowledge had value that showed up in a number, because things without numbers attached were easy to treat as optional. Cal Rourke referred 3 clients to her in May. William Hart referred 2. Frank Dillard, whose supply routes gave him the broadest view of who needed what across the territory, referred 4 over the course of the spring and summer, each referral accompanied by a brief description that told her exactly what the situation was and what the most relevant aspects of her knowledge base would be. She taught 43 families over the course of 1877 and 1878 by her own count. The number was meaningful not because of its choices, but because of what it represented: 43 separate situations in which the knowledge her father had given her in a German forest had been translated through Montana conditions into something a specific family could use to survive a specific winter. Each translation was slightly different. The Alderman Brothers coal supplementation operation required modifications to the standard design to handle the heavier condensation load that coal combustion produced. A homestead family near Canyon Creek had no rock slide alcove available and needed a freestanding version that used the earth berming technique to substitute for the natural shelter. A widow named Agnes Pratt, who reminded Astrid of herself at 30, had questions about the dugout design that went beyond storage into habitation, and those conversations ran longer than the standard instruction because the territory they covered was larger. Agnes Pratt became, over the course of 1878 and 1879, something close to what Astrid would have called a colleague if the word had fit naturally into the vocabulary of how frontier women described their professional relationships, which it mostly didn't. Agnes learned the techniques, applied them to her own situation, and began teaching them to her neighbors, adding her own observations from her specific terrain and climate pocket south of Helena. The knowledge was developing in the way that practical knowledge developed when multiple people were using and modifying it, accumulating variations, refining under different conditions, becoming more robust as more failure modes were discovered and addressed. The 1880 territorial census arrived in the summer, and the enumerator came to her site on a Tuesday morning in July. He was a young man from the territorial office named Greer, who had the careful handwriting of someone who'd been trained that the record mattered and was taking the instructions seriously. He asked her name, age, property value, occupation. She told him Astrid Voss, 45. Property value, $180. Occupation, and she paused here, choosing the words that were accurate rather than the words that were conventional: teacher of practical building techniques. Greer wrote it down without asking for clarification. $180 was not nothing for a single woman. It represented the accumulated effect of 5 years of consulting work, 2 small land purchases made at the right time with the cash she'd accumulated, and the compound interest of a reputation that had grown steadily enough that she could now choose her clients rather than accepting whoever came. She looked at what he'd written, the entry that would sit in the territorial archive, and recognized it as the official form of the story she'd been living since September 1876. Not the whole story, not the part about the frost-killed asters or the Norwegian family from 1874, or the exact texture of Britta Halverson's expression in the basement when she understood what was being offered. Those parts didn't fit in census columns. But the number and the occupation and the fact of property owned by a woman whose name ended in a consonant in a territory where neither women nor German immigrants were especially expected to succeed, those were the parts that survived in documents, and documents outlasted memory. The years from 1880 to 1890 moved in the way of years that are full of work and contain no single dramatic event large enough to become the organizing principle of the period in retrospect. She bought land she'd had her eye on since 1878. She hired labor for the first time, discovering that explaining a technique to someone who was paid to execute it was fundamentally different from explaining it to someone who was desperate enough to actually learn it. Desperation, she found, was an excellent pedagogical tool. Employment was a more complicated motivator. She built a house in 1884, a story and a half with a solid foundation and good insulation in the walls, built with a combination of the techniques she'd developed in the milled lumber she could now afford. The house had a cellar that used the earth-sheltered thermal mass principle she'd been applying in various forms since the dugout. The woodshed attached to the north side of the house used the barrel vault design scaled up with stone foundation courses at the base and a proper door with iron hardware. It had cost all told about $40 to build. Cal Rourke saw it when it was finished and stood looking at it for a long moment. He was 58 now, the knee injury more pronounced, the hair gone entirely silver, but the engineering attention still operating with the same precision. The original cost $7, he said, not quite a question. The original had different constraints. The original was better for those constraints. Yes, she said, and this one is better for these. The question was never which design was superior in absolute terms. The question was always which design was appropriate to the specific situation. He turned that over. That's how you should be teaching it, not as a technique, as a principle. That is how I teach it. The winter of 1886 was the worst in Montana in 2 decades. The cattle losses on the open range were catastrophic, ending ranching operations that had been running for 15 years, enforcing a fundamental reconsideration of the industry's basic assumptions about what Montana winters were. The homestead operations that had followed the low-cost building methods had better outcomes than the average, not because of anything magical about curved wood and clay, but because the people who'd built those structures had been forced in the process of building them to think carefully about winter preparation rather than relying on convention. The thinking was worth as much as the structures. She spent that winter consulting through written correspondence that Frank Dillard's operation had become an informal conduit for over the years. She received letters with questions about specific construction failures and responded with diagnoses and remedies. She received a letter from Patterson at the territorial office, now in a senior position, telling her that the building methods documented in his 1876 report had been incorporated into a practical guide for new homestead settlers that the office was distributing with land grants. She wrote back thanking him and asking whether the guide acknowledged its sources. His response was polite and indirect in the way of official correspondence on awkward subjects, which told her everything she needed to know. The guide was useful. The sources were unacknowledged. This was the pattern she'd understood would apply since the Herald ran its unattributed item in 1877, and she had made her peace with it in the same transaction in which she decided that the knowledge mattered more than the credit. What she had not made peace with, and never fully did, was the specific texture of that trade-off, the way that practical knowledge developed and held and transmitted by women moved through institutional channels, with the attribution stripped out, arriving in the official record as something discovered by the system rather than contributed to it by identifiable people. She held this awareness the way she held all the things she couldn't change, not ignoring it, not being destroyed by it, keeping it in the inventory as a fact about the world that shaped her actions without determining them. By 1890, she owned 320 acres, a mix of creek bottom, productivity, and hillside timber. She had 2 employees, both women who'd come to her initially for instruction and stayed for work when it became available, both now capable of conducting consultations on the standard designs without her direct involvement. She held a small interest in 2 mining operations north of Helena, not as an active participant, but as an investor, having been approached by operators who wanted her judgment on their construction and storage infrastructure in exchange for a percentage arrangement. She had not expected to be an investor. She had expected to be alive and independent and useful, which she was, and the investment had been a consequence of those qualities rather than their cause. The spring of 1895 brought Era Halverson back to Helena after 12 years in Wisconsin, where she'd been teaching at a normal school and had married a carpenter named Ross. She came back with two children of her own and the particular settled confidence of someone who'd been competent for long enough that competence had become invisible, simply the baseline condition, the starting point rather than the achievement. She was 26 years old and looked exactly like what she was, a person who had learned at age 7 that resources were finite and knowledge was not, and had been running on that understanding ever since. She came to see Astrid 2 days after arriving without ceremony. She sat in the kitchen and drank tea and described what she'd been doing in Wisconsin, and then she described what she wanted to do next, develop a more formal curriculum for the practical building techniques she'd been absorbing in pieces since 1876 and teaching informally to homestead families near the normal school. The knowledge exists, Era said, but it's distributed. There's no single place where it's organized, and it keeps having to be reinvented by people who don't know it's already been developed. That's been true of most practical knowledge for most of history. It doesn't have to stay that way. Astrid looked at her across the table, the 7-year-old who'd adjusted the air gap in the wood stack because the principal demanded it, was now a 26-year-old identifying a systemic problem in how practical knowledge was transmitted and proposing to address it. The line between those two people was completely continuous. "What do you need from me?" Astrid asked. "Everything you know, organized in a form that can be written down and taught by people who didn't learn it from you directly." And they spent the summer of 1895 doing exactly that, working through the full body of technique that had accumulated since 1876, organizing it into principles rather than procedures, identifying the underlying physics that made each technique work so that variations could be derived rather than memorized. Ira wrote everything in the clear, precise prose of a trained teacher. Astrid read each draft and made corrections and additions in the margins, sometimes rearranging the sequence to reflect the order in which understanding actually built, rather than the order in which it might seem logical to present it. The document that resulted was not published. It was copied by hand by Era, producing 6 copies that went to specific people in specific places where the knowledge would be used. One to the Territorial Office's Land Management Division, one to the Normal School in Wisconsin, one to a homestead association in Dakota that Frank Dillard had connected her with years earlier, one to William Hart's son who'd taken over his father's building operation after William died in 1892, one to Agnes Pratt, who was by then teaching the techniques in 3 counties south of Helena, one she kept herself. The original woodshed continued to stand against the hillside through the remainder of the 1890s and into the new century. She'd stopped using it for active wood storage in 1884 when the attached shed at the house became her primary supply. But she checked it annually, running the same assessment she'd run after that first October storm, touching the clay walls, checking the roof junctions, pulling a piece of wood from the back, and testing the moisture content. The structure had required maintenance twice in all those years, once in 1881, when a section of bark shingles had been damaged by a falling branch replaced in a morning with materials she cut from the same ridge above, and once in 1893, when a section of the clay wall had cracked along a joint that had never been fully consolidated in the original application. Otherwise, the structure had maintained itself, which was the test of a correctly built thing. Not that it required no attention, but that the attention it required was proportional to what it was asked to do rather than exceeding it. On the morning she turned 68 in September 1903, she walked south along Prickly Pear Creek in the early light, following the path she'd walked for the first time on the afternoon of September 17, 1876. The creek was running low in the late summer way, clear over the gravel bed, talking to itself in the voice she'd been listening to for 27 years. The cottonwoods were beginning their turn, the yellow coming in, at the leaf edges. The same way it always came, the same color. It had been the first time she'd walked this path with 2 flour sacks and $7 and a specific problem that required a solution. The woodshed looked like the hillside had grown it. The bark roof had weathered to the color of the surrounding rock. The clay walls had acquired the patina of something old enough to be part of the landscape's permanent inventory. The board door that had replaced the burlap years ago had weathered to a gray that matched the overall structure so closely that it was easy to miss in passing. She opened it and stood in the threshold. The interior smelled the way old wood structures smell, dry and resinous and slightly of the earth that surrounded them. A smell that was not quite alive, but not quite inert, the smell of materials that had been doing what they were supposed to do for a long time and were continuing to do it. The rock face at the back was still solid. The willow frame, fully seasoned now for 27 years, was harder than it had been, green-locked in its curved position as completely as if it had been cast. She pressed her hand flat against the back wall the way she pressed it on the first afternoon and felt nothing move. She stood there for perhaps 5 minutes listening to the creek and the cottonwoods in the distance. Then she pulled the door closed behind her and walked back along the creek path in the full morning light. She had 43 acres of hay coming in before the first frost. She had firewood cut and stacked in the attached shed, enough for the winter and into spring. She had letters to write and work to plan, and a property that required consistent attention to remain what it was. She had, by every measure, she knew how to apply more than she needed. She had started with $7 and a deadline. She walked home.